Hello everyone, I am Professor Paul Carrier of the Western Michigan University Thomas M. Cooley Law School. And what I'd like to do now is to provide some information that should be helpful as you prepare for Class 4, as you work through the materials that are assigned for Class 4 of our Contracts 1 class. Keep in mind where we are. We have been talking about formation, and we have talked about and finished talking about the offer. We have also talked about acceptance, and last week we covered when the power of acceptance may be terminated and when it has to stay open under something like an option contract. Today, for the first part of the class, we cover one last major issue with regard to acceptance. I'll explain that in just a minute. And then we cover something else, and I'll talk about again in just a second. Next week, and for at least 2 weeks, we will be covering the third component of formation, which is the concept of consideration. What does each party give up as his or her part of the bargain? There has to be two on each side, with a few small exceptions. And finally, the fourth component of a formation is the concept of sufficient specificity of terms. Definiteness of terms is another way of thinking about it. Are there enough of the major terms to see that we have a full agreement and we are still not in a bargaining phase? And so if you and I talk about selling my guitar, but I don't give you a price, I don't give you a delivery date, I don't explain what kind of a guitar it is, electric versus acoustic, we don't have enough terms that we've been discussing for a contract to have been formed. Okay? On the other hand, we may have agreed to just about everything, and there may be one small piece missing that we have not discussed. And the question is whether or not we still have a formation, a mutuality, and assent by both parties, right, with definiteness of terms, or whether we're still in the bargaining phase. And that will cover as the last part of the materials we cover in Class 4. Remember last week, we talked about terminating the power of acceptance. And so if there was an offer on the one hand and a purported acceptance on the other, that made changes. At common law, that purported acceptance that made changes acted as a counteroffer, and it rejected the original offer, therefore terminating this offeree's power of acceptance and making this party the new offeror. And so what it has the effect of doing is flip-flopping the titles of the parties. Starts as offeror, starts as offeree, makes a change, so it becomes the offeror, and now this party becomes the offeree. Hopefully that's not as complicated as it looks using my hands, but please, if you can, get your minds around that concept, because sometimes that can be so confusing as an initial matter, you can make serious mistakes when you're looking at a fact pattern, and you need to determine who is the offeror, who is the offeree, because that could be a critical distinction. Okay? Counteroffers typically, well, of course, counteroffers do terminate the prior offer, and there's a common law rule of which you need to be aware. That is the mirror image rule. Mirror image rule. And what that holds, still does, with perhaps a little bit of softening, is that if a purported acceptance is different in any way from the offer, it is not an acceptance, it is a counteroffer and therefore a rejection. And so if we agree on 4 points here, and I'm the offeror, and you send back a list of those 4 plus one more, a fifth, it's not a mirror image, okay? And at common law, when something was different, that would turn it into a counteroffer rejection. That is the common law mirror image rule. It is still in play today. It is softened a little bit in a way I hope to explain a little bit later in this presentation, and if not, certainly during the class period this week. The Uniform Commercial Code in Article 2 has very specific treatment of this concept of an acceptance or purported acceptance that has some slightly different terms in it. And there is a marked preference in such cases to treat it not as a rejection counteroffer, but as something else where we have a formed agreement. Rather than throw these other things that are agreed upon out, We agree that those are locked in, and then the courts need to determine with regard to the other terms whether or how they actually become part of the deal, or whether they are simply left to the side and do not become part of the deal. In other words, there's a preference to avoid a rejection counteroffer in a way or in ways that I'll explain in just a minute. Going back to this concept of UCC 2-207, which is called the Battle of the Forms provision, in its subsection 1, it preserves the common law mirror image rule, however begrudgingly. The idea is we don't like the mirror image rule, and we will try not to apply it in Article 2 sales of goods. However, if one party specifically demands it, requires it, we can't say that such party is not allowed to maintain that rule. It must, however, be specifically invoked. If it's not there, we don't apply it because we do not like the mirror image rule as a group of tradesmen and lawyers and judges who are well familiar with how trade works, particularly sales of goods. Okay? In other words, the UCC tries to avoid it, but does not disallow it. And sometimes you might see the word, or the concept, proviso clause. And the idea behind that is if there's this document and then the other side sends another document and the other side sends another document and the second party sends the fourth document, we start having a lot of commonality of terms, but at least a few differences. Are each of those rejections counteroffers going back and forth and back and forth? Or can we take at least one of them and say, you know what, that looks like the offer. This looks like the acceptance, even though it has something a little bit different. Let's still treat it as an acceptance, which means that we have a formation, and then let's figure out how to deal with that one extra piece that doesn't quite fit. Again, not rejecting it under the mirror image rule of common law, but saving the contract and simply finding a way to deal with the one or two smaller different terms on which the parties did not specifically agree. And think about the intent. Chances are in significantly large contracts, complicated contracts, there are tons of different terms going back and forth. And for the most part, the merchants who deal with this don't care. Small thing. You make widgets. I send back an acceptance that says, I want the widgets, but they all have to be blue. You probably don't care what color you make them or you send to me because you're so large and you make multicolors. Here's the problem. In common law, that designation of blue could be a rejection counteroffer because it's not the mirror image of what you sent to me. Okay? What the UCC tries to do is tries to say that blue thing is a new term and it's a mere proposal. Okay? The additional term, which is different, is a proposal. However, we still try to form the contract. What do we do with that proposal? Subsection 2 in the first part of 2-207. If you're dealing with at least one non-merchant or two non-merchants, that proposal sits there for the other party to accept or say nothing. If the other party, however, does not specifically accept that proposal, that additional term, which is considered a proposal, it drops out. Okay? So, if we are non-merchants and I agree to everything that you send to me with regard to widgets, and I write another term that you didn't include, however, I need them all to be blue, we might still have an agreement since it's a sale of goods, but the blue term simply falls out. Because if we're not merchants and you didn't agree to it, you're not bound by it. Now, let's make us both merchants. Additional terms like that are proposals. The difference is they, however, if they're not a big deal, if they're not really significant problems, actually become automatically part of the agreement. So that blue, if it's not a big deal, you would now be bound by. We've agreed, the blue was a proposal, you said nothing, it goes into the agreement, and later on I can enforce that. There are exceptions to that automatic adoption of these proposals as contract terms, however, and there are three forms that you should memorize, and one of them is the other side objects. If I put in blue and it's not a big deal, you're going to be bound by that as a merchant who did not reject, and it's not really a big deal. And in fact, we're preserving almost the entire contract and not making a big deal out of one small term. Okay? You could, however, and this is one of the exceptions, call me up, write me and say, no, I can't give blue, that they're more expensive. I can give you red, they're cheaper. So you specifically rejected that proposal. And so because you've done that, then this idea that it's automatically part of the contract between merchants, unless there's an exception, means that the exception applies here because you've called me, you've notified me, I disagree. Now that is not part of our bargain. We might still have a bargain, but my request for all blue would not work. Another example is when it's a material term. If the white chips are very cheap to make and the blue chips are very, very much more expensive to make, and you and I are merchants and you put a specific price down, I will sell you the widgets 45 cents, right? And you didn't specifically lay out white ones are 45 cents, blue ones are $3 a piece, as an example. I write back, yes, they'd have to be blue only, and in my mind, I'm hoping to get them for 45 cents. But in your mind, you're like, no, that's only for the simple blank white ones that we don't change at all. That was what I intended. What you're proposing will make me go broke. That's a crazy contract. I don't agree. That is a material alteration. Okay? So if the color prices are extremely similar, that would probably, as between merchants, automatically become part of the contract. If it's a major difference, a material alteration, that one would simply drop out. Okay? So in other words, this concept of additional terms automatically becoming part of the contract between merchants is the rule with a few exceptions, and again, we'll go over more of those in class. There's a third subsection I want to cover in class and not here, and that's where the parties don't really have an agreement on the two different forms that they use. I send my purchase order, you send your sales order, I send an amended purchase order, you send an amended sales order, and we have all these documents going back and forth. What if we actually do not have an agreement, appropriate agreement? And yet, I've already shipped the goods to you. Courts, under subsection 3 of that article, can actually construct a contract from the writings with regard to the provisions on which the parties agree, plus the conduct as they perform. Okay? So you can find a contract, even though there is not a formed contract technically, the courts can look at subsequent performance from the point of those battling forms, and then cobble together an agreement. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to turn to the final part of today's class, which is this concept of the fourth component, the definiteness of terms. Clearly, if two parties have not agreed on a significant number of the major terms, we do not have a contract. We're still in the negotiating phase. Okay? What if the parties agree now to decide a term later, but provide a formula? Then we probably still have an agreement. I'll rent your apartment. I'm going to renew it in 2 years. If you let me, we'll agree, but the price, I can renew automatically at the market price in that area. We can figure that out. Okay, did we agree on the exact price for the renewal in 2 years? No. Did we agree on a mechanism that we can easily ascertain later? Yes. Therefore, that would be definite enough on price term, as well as the other terms surrounding that, like date of the move-in, for example. And so there's some movement toward not looking at certain gaps and determining that the parties have not fully agreed. So if there's something that is missing from a contract and it's not a really big deal, or if it is something where there's a mechanism to figure it out later with some formula, then we might still have a contract and it can be enforced, and courts will then worry or work on trying to determine the term that isn't quite definite enough. In other words, save the contract, work on getting to the definite terms, rather than throwing the contract out by saying it's so indefinite that we are going to treat it as continuing negotiations, but not yet a contract. By the same token, if you see one or two major terms that have not been agreed, chances are the parties don't have a mutual assent with regard to those, and we do not have a contract yet. I will try to teach you a term. It's called Dickert terms later. If we don't agree on the date of shipping, that might not be a big deal. We still should have an agreement. If we disagree on price and quantity, that's a big deal. We probably do not yet have a contract. Okay, see you Friday.